Alright kids, welcome to your Unit 2 review. This is going to be a quick review. I encourage everyone to come to the tutoring session Tuesday morning in the cafeteria. I believe there is a study party that you could also attend. And we will be completing a study guide together in class in preparation, but in case you want some extra help at home while you are working, there's also this video. So Unit 2, we've talked about a lot. We've talked about colonization in Georgia, people coming to Georgia for the first time when Georgia was a colony, not a state. Remember, it wasn't until after the American Revolution that we became the United States of America. Before, we were colonies of Great Britain. So basically, this unit, we have learned how that happened. How did we become a colony of Great Britain instead of a colony of Spain? What happened to the Native Americans? We started learning about that. So first, speaking of Native Americans, let's talk about the Mississippian culture. So the Mississippians, basically throughout history, you had 4 different groups of Native Americans, starting with the prehistoric Paleo. We don't really talk much about them in class because, well, we're talking like 10,000 years ago, right? So you have the Paleo, Archaic, and Woodland Indian time periods. And this really was more like time periods, not separate groups necessarily. And then you get to the Mississippian Indians. A lot of historians agree that it was about the time, like year 800, when we first saw them. But these are the Native Americans that are going to be around who have the first interactions with European settlers and explorers in the New World, as they called it. So the Mississippian Indians were quite advanced. They lived in chiefdoms, so kind of like how a kingdom has a king, chiefdoms have a chief. Their culture, sometimes they would have tattoos, they would have ornaments and headdresses. They really started forming identities among their different tribes. They were hunters, but they did not abandon gathering. They had fruits and berries, of course. They would gather nuts as well. But they would hunt small mammals, deer, turkey, beavers, muskrats, sometimes. And they would use anything from spears to bow and arrows. And they would also use knives made out of a rock called chert, C-H-E-R-T, I believe. I really hope I didn't misspell that for the video. That'd be embarrassing. The food, I already talked about their food. Shelter. So shelter was a big deal for the Mississippians. First off, in their towns and villages, and I'm not talking like little tiny villages, we're talking large city-like villages. They would have mounds, earthen mounds, that would be at the center, kind of like a plaza of their villages. And surrounding the villages were palisades and moats. Palisades were large wooden fences. What this tells historians is that they needed protection, either from each other, from other invaders. This was also the first group of Native Americans to practice horticulture. Fancy word for gardening. They were the first ones to really start planting crops. Now, they didn't do it like we do, where you have corn over here, pumpkins over here, tomatoes over here. They kind of put everything mixed together. But they were the first ones to actually purposefully grow crops. Now, what happened when the Mississippians interacted with Europeans? Well, unfortunately, many of them succumbed to disease. Smallpox was the disease that was brought over by the Spanish when they were exploring, and it wiped out Native Americans. Between smallpox and the occasional hostile bouts of violence between European explorers and the Mississippians had to reorganize. And it was after this reorganization, after the Spanish were gone, after the Spanish had their big impact on the Mississippians, that you had Native American groups like the Creek and the Cherokee start forming. Basically, imagine this: if all of our home rooms were Native American tribes, and most people succumbed to smallpox, and in one homeroom all the hunters were no longer here, well, you might want to go team up with some other tribes that might have some hunters now. So they did have to reorganize. So the first Spanish explorer that came into Georgia was Hernando de Soto. And Hernando de Soto and his men, they came to Georgia looking for the 3 G's, as we call it: gold, God, and glory. They wanted gold for the Spanish treasury. make their king happy, find them lots of gold. They wanted to spread their Roman Catholic faith. And they wanted the glory of conquest. They wanted to conquer more lands. They were not successful, though. They didn't find gold. In fact, a lot of Native Americans, we're not really sure if they knew where the gold was or not. There was gold in Georgia. It was found later. But Native American tribes even started lying to the Spanish, telling them to go places where there was no gold just to try to save themselves. But there was no gold. And Hernando de Soto eventually would die in Florida. So they did not consider his exploration through Georgia a success. There were also Spanish missions built along the barrier islands, and also as inland as around Valdosta, Georgia, near the Okeechobee Swamp as well. And these missions were churches. Think about like a missionary. A missionary is someone who spreads their religion. And there's many different ways they can do this. Well, the Spanish missions were built to do the same thing. But a lot of Native Americans pushed against them because they did not like the changes to their culture, and they didn't like kind of being forced to assimilate to a new culture. So, the missions also end up failing. In fact, the British in South Carolina encouraged the Native Americans to go raid and attack those missions, and even at one point in the 1600s and later 1600s, I believe it was around 1684 or somewhere around there, there was a pirate raid. Yes, pirates. And that kind of ended the missions in Georgia. There were still missions in Florida. The Spanish stayed in Florida a lot longer, but that did end the missions in Georgia. Just like interactions with Hernando de Soto and their men, a lot of disease, such as smallpox, was also spread through the Spanish missions. So that kind of ended the Spanish and their influence in Georgia. And after that, the English were coming to Georgia. Now, there were a few reasons why the English wanted to come to Georgia. The Charter of 1732 was the document that gave the English permission to settle Georgia as a colony. We'll talk about James Oglethorpe here in a minute, but the Charter set out three main reasons why Georgia would be formed: philanthropy, economics, and defense. Philanthropy is a fancy word for charity. And the idea was to give people a new start. If people came to Georgia, they would get 50 acres of land, they would get a year's supply of seed and agricultural supplies, and they would get a year's supply of food. And if they paid their own way, they could get as much as 500 acres of land. So that was how they were charitable towards the new settlers coming to Georgia. Economics. The idea of mercantilism. So mercantilism, it sounds similar to the word merchant, and if you remember through any historical studies, a merchant is a person who sells goods. So mercantilism is the idea that you have colonies that provide goods and resources to the mother country. So basically, instead of the mother country having to rely on other countries for goods and services, such as cotton, tobacco, other crops that maybe you can't grow in certain places, instead of having to buy those things from other countries, which would cause you to have more dependence on those countries, why not just set up colonies in other places of the world so you don't have to buy from anyone else anymore? So it's kind of like the mother country is the rich lady, and the colonies are the servants. And so the colonies, their job is to provide those raw materials and those goods to the mother country, so they don't really have to do too much work and they don't have to shell out their money for it. So when they came to Georgia, they really wanted people to grow indigo, rice, silk, attempt wine production. They realized that having a vineyard in the very hot and humid coast of Georgia would not be very good. Unfortunately, none of these were really a success. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But that's what they wanted people to do. They wanted Georgia to become another colony, like South Carolina, that would grow certain crops for the good of the mother country, which was Great Britain. And then we were also a colony set up for defense. In the charter, they knew that they needed to establish rules for a buffer colony. A buffer is like if you have this dude trying to fight with this dude over here, why not get in the middle, be a buffer? You might get beat up in the process, but you did your job. You kept them from fighting. So basically that's what Georgia was. You had Florida and you had South Carolina. The British were in South Carolina. The Spanish were in Florida. Georgia was in between to keep those two from fighting, to keep the Spanish from attacking those profitable colonies, profitable plantations in South Carolina. Defense was really the only way that Trustee Georgia was successful. We did do our job as a buffer colony. However, in Trustee Georgia, when I say Trustee Georgia, I mean during the Trustee period, so that was supposed to be 1732 to 1752. However, due to the fact that the Trustee period was not very successful, Trustee period ended in 1751. So the trustees. A trustee is a person who acts on behalf of another person, right? You're trusting them to do the job. But a trustee also didn't need to be someone with too much power. There were 21 trustees, and these trustees were not allowed to own land, they weren't allowed to hold public office in Georgia, and they weren't allowed to get paid for their work. Now, because of this, it makes sense that most of these dudes would not come over to Georgia. Only one of them did, and that was James Oglethorpe, which is one reason why a lot of people saw him as the founder of Georgia. He was one of 21 trustees, but he was the guy that actually made it to Georgia to help establish the colony. And these trustees made laws and rules for the colonists. So for one thing, the colonists could not have rum. No liquor in the new colony. They felt that liquor would make them lazy. They felt that people wouldn't really do their job if they were drinking all the time. No slavery. James Oglethorpe and the other trustees wanted to establish a hard-working colony that would not depend on slave labor. No Catholics were allowed. Now, this really was a huge problem, but the Church of England is what ruled in the English world. And the rest of the world, you had a lot of tension between the Church of England and the Roman Catholic Church that has a lot to do with the follow-up in England for the Protestant Reformation. We don't really have time to go into all that history, but basically, the Protestant Reformation happening and starting around in the 16th century in Europe, and then as we go on with the years, Great Britain's going to jump on that train. They're going to start the Anglican Church, break away from the Pope and Roman Catholic rule, and from that, you had the Anglican Church. So Catholics weren't always welcome in Great Britain. Even though it was a form of Christianity, Catholics had a hard time in English colonies as well. And some historians believe there were also no lawyers allowed as well. So, these rules made a lot of the colonists mad. We're going to get to the malcontents in a moment, but before I do that, let's talk about the important people of the trustee period. James Oglethorpe, like I said, a lot of people believed he was the founder or father of Georgia. He was one of 21 trustees. He did go to Georgia to help establish the colony, though, which is why he was so respected, because he was a big part of getting the colony started. James Oglethorpe originally wanted the colony of Georgia to be a debtor's colony. Someone who's in debt in Great Britain in the 18th century would be put in jail. If you owe someone money, jail. And those jail cells were nasty. You have lots of people sharing one place, no bathroom, think about it, not very fun. So, his friend Robert Castell ended up going to prison. And through the horrible experiences that his friend Robert had, he wanted to really create a debtor's colony. Let these people out of jail, give them a fresh start, give them a new life. Well, the British government was like, no, they're not leaving jail. But they did make kind of some compromises by having the philanthropy part of the Charter of 1732 and giving people who were poor, what they called the worthy poor, a fresh start. Eventually, James Oglethorpe had to leave Georgia. He had a couple of failed campaigns to capture St. Augustine in Florida, and because of people like the malcontents, who were dissenters, people who went against the trustee rules, he wasn't really able to help develop a lot of leadership in the trustee colony. And so the trustees and James Oglethorpe withdrew their leadership, and in 1751 was when the trustee period ended. But James Oglethorpe did get called back before then to Great Britain. Now, James Oglethorpe had a really good friendship with Chief Tomochichi. Chief Tomochichi was the leader of the Yamakra Native Americans. That's who lived on the land where Savannah is now, before James Oglethorpe and the other colonists landed. They landed at Yamacraw Bluff, and Chief Tomochichi was very welcoming, really established a lot of peace between James Oglethorpe and the British colonists and his people, the Yamacraw Indians. And their friendship lasted for years. He even traveled to Great Britain with James Oglethorpe, and because of the way that he helped the colony of Savannah get established, he moved his people upriver so that the people of Great Britain who came to Georgia could have the Yamacraw Bluff to build Savannah. He helped establish trading posts. He worked with Mary Musgrove and James Oglethorpe to make sure that peace continued between the Yamacraw and the British. So the British even honored him by burying him in Savannah with British military honors. Now, I just mentioned Mary Musgrove. Mary Musgrove was half Native American, half British. Her mom was Creek. So she could speak both languages, and she understood the customs and the cultures of both. So James Oglethorpe ended up hiring her, basically, to work, and she worked for him for 10 years as a translator and interpreter that helped with everything from economic negotiations to political negotiations. She was granted land, but the British didn't really want to give her that land. Eventually, after a lot of drama, she settled for St. Catherine's Island. An island's pretty cool. She was only there for about 3 years before she passed away, but she did receive some land, even though women in trustee Georgia weren't allowed to own land, as a reward for her service. Now, speaking of people who were upset with trustee Georgia, let's talk about the malcontents. Malcontents were people who did not agree with the rules of the trustees. The malcontents were upset about land ownership restrictions, about how much land they could buy. Women could not inherit land. That was one thing the malcontents pushed to get changed that was positive. Most of the things, though, that the malcontents stood for were pretty negative, the biggest being slavery. They wanted slavery. They saw that in South Carolina, that the plantation owners were making a whole lot more money and were way more profitable because they had slave labor. So the malcontents did pressure this. They petitioned the trustees. That failed. Well, even when they started moving away from Georgia, they created pamphlets, little booklets basically, to pressure the British and other people to support changing the trustee rules. And it was really the pressure from the malcontents that led to the end of the trustee period in 1751. Jewish people in Georgia. Now let's talk about some of the immigrants. So Portuguese Jews came to Georgia about 5 months after James Oglethorpe did. Initially, at first, they were banned. They were not allowed in Georgia. But a lot of people, about 20 people, plus a doctor, all died of yellow fever. So now you have no doctor in the colony of Georgia. Well, they changed the rules. Now the Jewish people can stay because Dr. Samuel Nunes was a member of the Jews that came to Georgia. And he's even credited with saving the colony. He told everyone, take some cold baths, drink some cold liquids, and all of a sudden their fever started going down. Medicine was not as advanced back then. That was considered some hard thinking work there. But the Portuguese Jews did find a home there. Not all of them, a little over 40 came to Georgia, but only about 14 stayed. They were given land. And let's see, other groups that came. Sorry, had a little brain fart there for a minute. Salzburgers. The Salzburgers, and no, I'm not talking about a yummy burger. We're talking about people from Salzburg. Today, Salzburg is a part of Austria. Back then, Salzburg was a part of the German Empire. So Salzburg became, basically, let me back up there. Germany was the hub of the Protestant Reformation. A Protestant, the Salzburgers were Protestants, is a person who is a Christian but who is not a Catholic. Think about the name Protestant. The word protest is in that name. They were protesting against the Catholic Church. And even though they did gain a lot of support, Lutherans gained a lot of support. They were Lutheran. They followed the beliefs of Martin Luther. Calvinists, following John Calvin, they all gained a lot of support. But they still weren't completely accepted. And there was something called the Edict of Expulsion in Salzburg, basically saying, hey, Salzburgers, you got 3 months to get out of here. You're going to be persecuted for your religious beliefs. King George was himself a Protestant, followed the same beliefs as the German Protestants. He was born in Hanover, Germany. And so King George said, hey, why don't you go to my new colony? You can be a Protestant there. So the Salzburgers did. They first landed in Georgia and were given land that they called Ebenezer. However, the land was very swampy. They were not able to grow lots of crops, and it wasn't very successful. So after a lot of people of the Salzburgers died over 2 years, they ended up moving to new land, which a lot of that wasn't just because of the land. A lot of that was because they were not very skilled laborers. They were hard workers, very hard workers, people. They became very industrious, but they had to work hard at it. They moved to a place that they call New Ebenezer. There is a Lutheran church there, still there today. That is their original church. It's obviously been renovated a few times, that you can still visit. They were also the first in Georgia to have a water-powered grist mill, an orphanage, and a Sunday school. The Salzburgers, today, 250 years later, you still see, have some families from the original Salzburgers living in the coast of Georgia. And that leaves us with the Highland Scots, who obviously come from Scotland. So the Highland Scots, and please don't forget they come from Scotland. It's in their name. Every year kids miss that. Highland Scots, Scotland. The Highland Scots were recruited, brought here by James Oglethorpe because they were super powerful warriors. They were known for being warriors. And guys, the Highlands in Scotland are actually, it's pretty rough terrain. If you can survive there and not only grow crops and live, but also fight up there, you are pretty darn tough. Think about the movie Brave. That movie is actually based off of some truth in the way that the Scots lived. There weren't like magical fairies and crazy bears running around. Well, there might have been crazy bears, but not like bears that actually were someone's mom. But I'm not going to get on a tirade about Brave. It's a great movie. The Highland Scots came here with their warrior powers, and they helped fight in battles such as the Battle of Bloody Marsh. And the Battle of Bloody Marsh was a smaller battle of the War of Jenkins' Ear. Robert Jenkins, English dude, tried to take over a Spanish galleon, a Spanish ship. He was captured, they cut his ear off, returned to England, said, hey, we gotta go fight them. And then they did. Now, was that the main reason why they were fighting? No, that was the straw that broke the camel's back, right? That was the last straw. Is that the phrase? Straw that broke the camel's back? Anyways, that was the last straw. And so they had a little war over it. Well, the Battle of Bloody Marsh was a very successful battle. They also helped in the failed campaigns trying to capture St. Augustine. But the Battle of Bloody Marsh drove the Spanish out of Georgia. The Spanish never tried to take over land in Georgia again. So the Highland Scots were very successful in helping us be a buffer colony. And the Scots in Georgia established the city of Darien, Georgia, which is on the coast near where old Fort King George used to be. So, after the trustee period, we have the transition into the royal period. And the royal period, there were a lot of changes. So first off, slavery became legal. 1751 was when the trustee period ended. 1749, 1750, though, is when the laws of slavery changed. On top of that, eventually, rum. In 1742, rum was basically decriminalized. They weren't really punishing people for it yet. And then a few years later, they passed an act that would repeal the Rum Act, where they were banning rum. With these changes, you also had more land being open. So not only was there more land to buy, but there were less restrictions. Women could now inherit the land. And there was also, I'm trying to remember, leadership changes. This was the big one. The trustees are gone. Now royal governance is there. But the king can't come to Georgia. The king has to rule in Great Britain. So he's going to have royal governors represent him. And these royal governors were John Reynolds, Henry Ellis, and James Wright. John Reynolds was the first one. Wasn't very liked. He only lasted 2 years, 1754 to 1756. And John Reynolds, however, did have a big impact on how we structure our government. He created the bicameral legislature in Georgia, the bicameral General Assembly. And that means basically two houses. Bi, like a bicycle, 2 wheels. Bicameral, cameral comes from a Latin word that means house. So 2 houses. The bicameral legislature created a few acts. So one, all men between 16 and 60 had to serve in a militia, small military group. All men had to work 12 years helping build roads. And think about it, guys. A lot of people were like, no, that's not my job. That's beneath me. I'm not going to build a road. A lot of the colonists really didn't like his style of leadership, although he had some pretty good ideas, in my opinion, to help build the infrastructure. But it didn't really fly. He also helped pass an act that said only white men who owned property could vote. So there were also voting restrictions. He wasn't very well liked, like I said. He didn't get along with the General Assembly. The people really didn't like him, so in 1756 he was recalled, like a bad toy that's broke. He was recalled back to Great Britain, so they made him go back to Great Britain. And the second royal governor was Henry Ellis. Henry Ellis was very sickly. Because he was so sick, it was hard for him to live in the harsh climate of Georgia. A lot of the colonists from the trustee period to the royal period had a hard time with the climate of Georgia. It was hot, it was sticky, it was humid. When people got sick, they had a hard time fighting things off. A lot of diseases were carried through mosquitoes. And think about it, some people had never really had exposure to mosquitoes before. They're going to see these bugs and these disease-carrying gross things when they come to Georgia. So the climate was very harsh for a lot of people, and a lot of people weren't able to stay in Georgia because of the climate and their reactions to it. Henry Ellis was one of those people. They had been giving him another appointment as governance in Nova Scotia, which is in Canada, much colder, but he eventually just goes back to Great Britain. But before he did that, one of the great things that he did was he created 8 parishes. A parish is kind of like a county. So the structure of our counties in Georgia, how they started on the coast of Georgia, really started with him as governor. And he was a pretty well-liked governor as well. The third governor, and the one who did the most work, was James Wright. Now, when James Wright took over, people liked him pretty well, right? He did a lot of cool things. But James, unfortunately, was governor during the time and the start of the American Revolution. So in the 1760s, when a lot of these acts were being passed, taxes such as the Stamp Act, revolutionary spirit was igniting. People were getting ready to revolutionize. And the Stamp Act was a tax on all paper goods. And Georgia was the only one to enforce it. Now, one of the reasons why Georgia was slow to join, and we'll talk more about this next unit actually, but one of the reasons why James was able to hold on to some power for a while was because Georgia was a baby country, and when you're a baby, you need your mama. Mama's Great Britain. We're the youngest of the colonies. Some of the colonies are teenagers, some of them are middle schoolers, some of them are little kids, and some of them are kicking and screaming toddlers. Well, Georgia basically went from being newborn to kicking and screaming toddler in a span of a few years when the American Revolution kicked off. And in 1776, he was placed under house arrest. When he escaped, he goes back to Great Britain, and he's like, okay, I might be babysitting that little baby Georgia over there, but that Georgia's growing up, and now they're pitching a fit, and I need Mama Great Britain to take over. Well, Great Britain goes back. There's more fighting. He goes back, but he cannot establish control. At this point, the people have really turned. There are less loyalists, people loyal to the king, and James Wright was not able to establish firm leadership anymore. So he returns in 1783 to Great Britain, died in 1785, never returned to Georgia again. He was the most able of the royal governors, though. Okay, so I just covered a lot of stuff, like a lot of stuff. I really, really hope that helped you some. If you have questions, please ask me in class. I did throw some dates out there and stuff like that. Don't focus so much on that. Focus on understanding the things of colonization in Georgia. Make sure you know the differences between the people, the royal governors, the people of trustee Georgia, such as James Oglethorpe, Mary Musgrove, Chieftain Winchichi. Make sure that you don't get confused between the reasons why the Spanish came here. The Spanish came for the 3 Gs, and the reason why the English came here, philanthropy, economics, and defense. And before I go, a lot of you had requested that Murphy, my cat, join me in this video. He's sleeping. Hold on. This might be bad. Don't kick. Don't kick. My kid's just going to say hey to you. And this is Murphy. 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 Say hey. Yeah, he's not interested. Ow. So, study.